Welcome, everyone. My name is Akasemi Newsom, and I'm Associate Director of the Institute of European Studies here at UC Berkeley. We are honored to have former Austrian Member of Parliament, Helmut Brandstätter, for a talk here today, titled Last Wake-Up Call for Europe. This discussion will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Karen Leibhardt, who is the 2022 Voigtstieber Visiting Professor here at the Institute. Karen.
Thank you very much, Akasemi, and thanks to the sponsor of today's event, the Institute of European Studies. Welcome, everyone. My name is Karen Leibhardt. Thank you for introducing me. I'm the Voigtstieber Visiting Professor at UC Berkeley this year, and I welcome all of you to this event, the people here in the seminar room and those following on Zoom, and the people who are on live stream. It is a particular great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Helmut Brandstätter, member of the Austrian Parliament since 2019. And Helmut Brandstätter holds a doctorate in law from the University of Vienna and a postgraduate degree from Johns Hopkins in Bologna. In 1982, he started his career as a journalist for Austria's national TV station, and he was a correspondent in Bonn and Brussels. In 1997, Brandstätter went to Berlin as managing director and editor-in-chief of the news channel NTV. And I can name a lot of other stations, but finally, since 2019, Helmut Brandstätter has been a member of parliament for the Liberal Party NEOS and also the party spokesperson for foreign policy. He's also the author of a couple of books, and it is his latest book, Last Wake-Up Call for Europe, which will hopefully be translated to English language as well in the near future. It's called Letzter Weckruf für Europa in German language, and this book will be presented today. The book and the talk address various crises Europe has faced over the past few years: the corona pandemic, the trade war between the US and China, authoritarian regimes emerging in EU member states such as Hungary and Poland, which are challenging the EU values. And especially the war in Ukraine at the moment shows that peace is not guaranteed in Europe anymore. And so Europe has shown historic unity in facing Russia with severe sanctions, and very, very recently also new sanctions were announced by the President of the European Commission, by the US President, and also by the UK. However, according to Helmut Brandstätter, Europe needed a wake-up call already before Putin's attack on Ukraine. The talk will take about 35 minutes and will be followed by Q&A. During the presentation, all those participating on Zoom are kindly invited to post questions in the chat, and we will be happy to present a selection of these questions to our speaker during the Q&A. For now, enjoy the presentation. Mr. Brandstätter, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's a really great honor for me to be back in Berkeley. I've been here in the year 2000 at Haas School of Economics. I did a course for 8 weeks, and I think I learned a lot, which I could use later on, also as managing director at NTV, which was partly owned by CNN, by the way. So I also had a strong tie to the United States and also to the American way of reporting, and that was very important for me, of course. When I just may I show this book again, because it was published in fall of 2020, and one thing, I dedicated this book to the generation of my children and their children, that they might live in peace. It's the one thing, and the second thing is I wrote about Kriegsherr, warlord Putin, and that he is already in the war in Europe, because as we know, in 2014, he started attacking Donbass, the Crimea. And there is another point which I really wrote a few pages about, the way of hybrid wars, which the Russians already had done before that time. So we know that he had a lot of ideas how he could destabilize Europe, and I will come back to that point. But I want to start with a few personal remarks. There's something which I also wrote in this book. My generation was the luckiest that ever lived in this part of Europe. There never had been a time where you could live so well as we did when we were born. And actually, I was born in an occupied country because I was born in April 1955, and there were still American soldiers and the soldiers of the three other powers in Austria. And only in May 1955, we got the State Treaty, which was very important. And then in October, the Austrian parliament voted for the law for neutrality, which is something which we are discussing right now. And probably that's also something we can discuss later on. So our life was more wealth, more growth. And then I was a correspondent in Germany in 1989. And I did, together with Chancellor Helmut a trip to Warsaw, November 1989. And we were sitting there in a room like this, and he always had in the evening or the late afternoon the German journalists with him. And to the Austrian, to me, always said, you part of us, you can come with us. And they were strictly background. And we were sitting there, we got the news that the Berlin Wall was open. And this was incredible because, first of all, he knew as much as we knew. So the German services and all the other services didn't know that the wall would be open. And then he said, later in the memoir, he wrote, then I said immediately I will go to Berlin. Actually, he didn't say that in the background conversation. What he said was, what are we doing now? And it was a journalist, was not me, it was a German journalist who said, you have to go to Berlin, of course, but you have to come back as well, because the visit to Poland was so important because of the history and everything that had happened in between. And actually, that's also a little piece of history which many people don't understand today. Helmut Kohl had kind of an Air Force One, a Luftwaffe, his own airplane. Could he fly with his airplane from Warsaw to Berlin? Of course, he could not, because of the four powers which were still managing Berlin. So he had to fly to Hamburg. There he took an American plane and he went to Berlin. The next day he came back. And this was history, of course. And then history continued in 1990 in Paris. We had the Charter of Paris. Not the end, but the very important step in this CSCE process, which is now the OSCE process. And the Charter of Paris, what does it say? All the countries, the European countries, the Canadians, and the Americans. What did they sign? They signed peace and secure borders for all the countries. And as we know, Mikhail Gorbachev, what did he say? The common house of Europe. And then, this is important for today, in 1991, the Ukrainians had the chance for their own referendum. And in all parts of Ukraine, and also in Crimea, there was a majority, a huge majority, most parts of Ukraine, a smaller majority, like 55% of Crimea, but they all wanted to have their country. And in 1994, there was the Budapest Memorandum. Ukrainians gave all the nuclear weapons to Russia, and the Russians signed for that. You gave us the nuclear weapons, and for that, you have the secure borders. That was in 1994. As we know, history changed very much. 2014, Crimea was taken, and now we are in the midst of the war. And I will come back to the war later on because it is so important. But when I talk about war, I talk about Europe. It's also something which I try to describe. From the very beginning, Europeans, the Homo sapiens, was settling in Europe. He was fighting wars. We found back 7,000 years ago, we found bones and skulls, and you can see on those artifacts, you can see that they were not dying in natural course. They were dying because they were slaughtered, they were killed, and also in some you can find some kind of cannibalism as well. So ever since there was war in Europe, and I just have a few a few slides to show you that this European history is so complicated. First of all, it's a history of wars. Secondly, it's also a history of different tribes moving to different areas. And this I just wanted to show you. This is around Caesar. You know, Caesar occupied huge parts of Europe. He went up to Britain until 400 after Christ. There were people, there were Romans in Britain. And what's also interesting, if you look at in Germany, many cities like Koblenz. Why is it called Koblenz? Because it's confluence, you know, the rivers coming together here. So wherever you go in Europe, you find this kind of Roman history. There are just a few more maps where I want to show how Europe changed over the century. Oh, here we go. It's me. I'm sorry. I have to do that. So here we go. So this is Charles Mann, and this is very important. He died in 814, and his sons, they divided the empire, and that was the beginning of France and Germany, of course. But look at this here. This is Khanat, yeah? And here you see a city called Kiev. Yeah, this is around 814. 880, there was the so-called Rus, and that's what Putin today says. He always says, this is our home country because Russia was founded in Kiev, which is completely wrong. At this time, this Khanat, this was a Turkish tribe. You know, there were Turkish tribe living there. Then from the north, there came Vikings, there came Normans. Then there came other tribes. So this was not Russia in 880 when he says. This was, as all of Europe was changing and different tribes moving and different people moving here and there. So there is no Russia in 880, but this area. And you also see here and there the Umayyaden, the Muslims in big parts also of Europe. Here we go. Yeah, this is important. Heiliges Römisches Reich Deutsche Nation. Yeah, this is the Holy Roman Empire of German nation. You see that was building, and the first Habsburg emperor was 1273, Rudolf I, and they governed until 1806. You know, Napoleon, and then there was the Austrian Empire until 1918. But you still see here Cordoba, still this area with the Muslims. You see them very much coming over to the Balkan area, which talk about the Balkans later on. And you see here also there is still no Russia. There are Russian. There's part of the Russian Empire, but all other areas are not. This is important part, of course, the 1618, 1648, the 30-year empire, and Henry Kissinger writes a big part of his book about about world order. It's called that it was so important that at the end, you know, there were like 50 million people living, and a third of them were killed after those 30 years. An incredible war in Europe, and but for him, the positive outcome was that at the end, the different countries decided that they were dealing with each other and they would accept the borders. Of course, they were still fighting and there were still wars, but at least there were kings dealing with each other, and they also could decide which religion to take. So the split of religions also is part of Europe. Yeah, this is 1683. That was the year when the Ottomans tried to occupy Vienna, which they did not manage. But you see, there's huge parts of Europe taken by the Ottomans. 1914, beginning of World War I, 17 million killed. 1939, that's what it looked like before, or in the year when Hitler attacked Poland, and then it's around 1949. So, and here the Iron Curtain, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, which Putin still says is the biggest catastrophe for for Russia and for the people in Russia. But I also know from the memoirs from Helmut, he wrote that in 1990 he talked to Mikhail Gorbachev in the winter of 1990, and Gorbachev told him, "I don't know how to feed my people within the next month." So the Soviet Union didn't dissolve because people didn't want to live there anymore, because they couldn't live anymore, because the economy just did not work. Talking about the economy, look at the figures of China in the 20 years ago and Russia 20 years ago. Gross national product more or less 1.2, 1.3 trillions. The Russians today more or less the same. The Chinese 14 trillions. So you see what kind of development China made and what kind of non-development the Russians made. And it's one of these problems. And the next is that there is a very strong philosophy within Russia with the name of Alexander Dugin, with his advisor, Vasily Surkov. And they always explain that there has to be a Eurasia, that this is all together. This is all together. And this should be one big empire against the decadent Americans and also against the Chinese. So if Russia attacks Ukraine, if Putin attacks Ukraine, it's only part of his plan. It's not the whole plan. And that's something which we in the West have to understand now. One of the reasons, there are many human reasons why we should help Ukraine, but this is one of the reasons why we really have to help the Ukraine. And on the other hand, and that's I always say, the biggest cultural success and political success which we ever had in Europe was the European Union, which started with the European Community of Steel and Coal in 1950, 1951, and then with the Roman Treaty in 1957. And ever since, we could live in peace. And I can tell you also a very personal remark. I had the chance to have an internship in Brussels at the European Commission in 1981, which was very difficult because Austria was very far away from the European Union. And so my father and other people helped me so I could stay half a year and work for the European Commission. And sometimes in the evening, when we were sitting together, a small group of people from different European countries, it was, like this, our fathers probably shot each other. They tried to kill each other. And we are sitting here together, drinking wine, eating, having fun, working hard, of course, and really have an idea how we want to plan this new Europe. And there was the basis, of course, as we know, from the Roman Treaty, but this is something which we have to continue. And there were so many crises ever since, on the one hand, 1989, as I said, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then different steps when more and more countries were joining the European Union. Of course, we had this huge 2008 crisis, Euro crisis. We had the crisis with the refugees in 2015. But as a matter of fact, Europe got stronger and stronger. And what we see now is not strong enough. I will say that in a second, but a stronger Europe, also with a strong America. And the question is, if this transatlantic friendship, we can renew or if that doesn't help. But first of all, we Europeans have to do our homework, and there is a lot to do. And I want to give you 6 theses now for the discussion. First is, there is a European identity, because there's sometimes the question, what do the Germans have together in common with the Greeks? There's a simple answer: it's beer, because there was a German nobleman many centuries ago who came to Greece, and he imported the German beer. So but there's much more in common. And very funny, it's an Englishman who wrote a book in 2015 called The European Identity, a conservative Englishman who obviously was not in favor of Brexit later on. And he's an Anglican priest and a banker, which is also an interesting combination. And I want just to read a few sentences, because this is probably the best I ever read about European identity. Some question whether a strong and primary European identity is even the right objective in an increasingly globalized world. But Europe does have shared interests and core values which have been hard-won through history. These shared values are part of the European proposition. Other layers of identity based on history, culture, and language will continue to define national, regional, and local loyalties, and are also fundamental to the self-understanding of Europeans. But these common values of the Europeans are the heritage of a tradition of thought which has been shaped by such towering figures as Galileo, Erasmus, Descartes, Locke, Hume, Kant, Hegel, and Darwin, and of course many others too. One of their different perspectives, and out of many and painful failures and wrong turnings we Europeans have taken over generations, has emerged something profoundly important for the world of the 21st century. A commitment to rationalism, democracy, individual rights, and responsibilities, the rule of law, social compassion, and an understanding of history as a dynamic, open, and progressive. These are worth our loyalty. This is the basis for European patriotism. And I think in a few words, he explains what the European identity is. As I said, we also can discuss about it later, but I think it's so important. And I have to say, not many politicians are strong and able enough to explain this kind of identity. And it's very easy if you're a member of a government in one of the European countries and something doesn't work out well, you say, it's the Brussels, they don't allow us this or that, which is most of the cases not true. But as I say, that's politics. My second thesis is we have to understand that the world has changed, and we should have understood that before the war against Ukraine. So Europe has to do reforms to become self-sufficient, to become stronger, and also to be able to defend herself militarily. Today, we are not able to defend ourselves. And this is a very sad message, but it's a very clear message. And that's something which we should have learned before this crisis already, but now we have to learn it, that there is the necessity that we have to build up our own army, that we have to build up our own defense, and as I said, hopefully together in our transatlantic ship with the Americans. My third thesis is that peace, as we see, is not secure, and there is more and more a division between one part of the world which follows the individual rights and democracy and rule of law, and another part of the world which follows autocratic rules. And this fight between those two systems was part of the Cold War, but it's much more complicated now, and it's reviving again. And this is something which many people have not understood yet. They think Putin wants to sell gas and wants to have a part of Ukraine. No, it's much more. He wants to change our way of life. And he's afraid that more and more Russians understand that Polish people today live much better than under the Soviet regime. And that's his biggest problem. He sees how well people in other countries do, how badly they do in their country, how well even China, also an autocratic country, evolved. But as I said, this is my thesis is we have to understand that it's more than a war. This is a fight between two very different systems. Number 4 for me, that's also important, is the Balkans. We've seen it before. Wars have started on the Balkans, and the influence of the Russians and also the Chinese on the Balkans are very strong. And there is an interesting quote from to explain how difficult this area is. It's a small area from President Tito, who was president of Yugoslavia, and after his death and after '89, of course, Yugoslavia fell into parts, and it also was a cruel war. 200,000 people were killed. We have the genocide of Srebrenica and many other things. What did Tito say? He said, I'm governing a country with 2 alphabets, 3 languages, 4 religions, 5 nationalities, who live in 6 republics with 7 minorities and 8 neighbors. And so you can imagine how complicated the situation is there. And it's getting even more complicated because more and more people are leaving those countries. We had a conversation with the ambassador of Bosnia 2 weeks ago, and they said even last year, 80,000 people, and that are the well-educated people, left Bosnia. We know that people leave also from Albania, from Serbia, and from other countries. And this is on the one hand. On the other hand, the Chinese come in with great investments, but they do investments like they finance a road in Montenegro. And if Montenegro can't pay, they say, okay, no problem. Then we own it, and we take the toll when the drivers drive through. That's probably the least problem. The bigger problem is the influence of Russia in Bosnia in the Republika Srpska. The president of Republika Srpska, Mr. Dodik, is of course a friend of Putin, and he helps Putin to destabilize Bosnia, which is a huge problem. And we have President Vučić, who's trying to do some swing politics between, on the one hand, he says, yeah, I love Europe and I want to be part of Europe. And on the other hand, he makes his deals with Russia and with China, which we have to tell him, I think, that he can't do it in the long run. And my last thesis, there is no end of history. There is no end of history, but I think history starts now new, and we have to find out. And I think that's something which I had talks to in Washington, to politicians and people from State Department, but also to professors and people from think tanks. There was this European-American friendship after the war, and of course it was quite easy because the Americans were so important to liberate Europe. They gave us the Marshall Plan, which was also kind of an advantage for America, but it was very important for us, and the development of Western Europe would not have been possible with that. There was this cultural influence, on the one hand, with music, jazz music and everything coming from America, but also the cultural influence as far as journalism, freedom of speech is concerned. You know, my predecessors in journalism in Austria, I talked to many of them, they were for a year in the United Hugo Partition, you know, those famous journalists of the 60s and 70s, the 50s, 60s and 70s, they were in American universities. They were taught what it means, freedom of speech. So these kind of values were very important for us. But of course, we had the 60s, we had the Vietnam War, which changed something. We had the Iraq War, which changed something. So the influence, the soft power of the United States diminished. And I don't have to mention Mr. Trump. And it's not only a question of soft power, it's also a question of hard power. When he gave one of his first interviews and said, I don't know if we need NATO anymore. Of course, that had also some influence on Europe. Okay, the Americans, they tend, which Obama already did, they tend more towards the Pacific and less towards Europe. And from all the talks I had in the last days in Washington, it was so interesting for me that all of them understood very well how Europe worked. I talked to Congressman Colin Red, all red from Texas, and he's in foreign committee, yes. But I really was positively surprised how much he knew about Europe. He was in Kiev, he was in Brussels within the last weeks, and you really could feel those strong ties, and that makes me optimistic. But it's not self-sufficient. You know, it means that we have to go there, that we have to speak to each other, and we have to find out where are our values, where do we agree, and where do we disagree, because that's also part of our relationship, that we can talk about it where we disagree. Ladies and gentlemen, I've many more ideas in my head and many more things I wanted to tell you, but I'm really very curious what questions we have now, and where you see where are the more important points, what we should talk more about. So I will stop at this point and ask you, please give me your remarks, your different views, of course, no problem with that, on the contrary. And then let's discuss how how Europe will change within the next week, and also how our relationship will change, and what is changed, and the world, how the world will change. I heard an interview, by the way, yesterday on radio by an economist who talked about globalization, about trade, will this change now? How will it change? I talked to Congressman Bill Keating in Washington, and he said, okay, TTIP didn't work for different reasons, but we already started with Europeans new talks in certain areas. So this we have to go back. Where can we cooperate on this? And of course, it's the big question of China. Last remark about China. I'm just reading a book by Elizabeth Economy, The World According to China. And it is a very good title, because the world, that's how Xi Jinping sees the world. He sees it according to China. And I also read a book by Michael Schumann about Chinese history. It's Superpower Interrupted, it's called. And he explains very well the different emperors over the centuries. And then he also explains, and she does it also in her book, how Xi Jinping sees himself as in heritage of those emperors, and that you have to go to Beijing to kowtow, and he decides with whom he will do trade, and he decides how they will do trade. And there is one, and the Chinese, they know to express themselves very well. And one expression of, and one sentence in one of the speeches of Xi Jinping was, we have to, everybody has to accept our sovereignty. And when he says sovereignty, of course, he means Hong Kong and Taiwan as well, no question. And he needs the ocean around the area. So first of all, they have to accept our sovereignty. And secondly, and that's even more interesting, we do not accept if someone interferes in our social balance and our social community. And what does that mean? It means if you say, is there really freedom of speech? What are you doing with the Uyghurs? What's happening there? You're already interfering in his social balance, because you're not allowed to do that. But how do we organize the relationship with a country who says it's only according to our rules and not the common rules which we try to find with each other? Right now, we are the weaker part, and I hope everybody knows that. Before I came here to the States, I had to take a COVID test, and they explained to me it will take longer now because the liquids you need for the COVID test, they come from China, and they don't come by train anymore because of the Russian war. So it takes a little longer. And I think it's similar in the States. You cannot do COVID tests without Chinese liquids. We cannot. I think you can't as well. It's only it's a very, very small example. There are more important ones. I talked to German business people in Washington also. But of course, they don't like to close factories now in Russia. They don't like to stop the trade. But what would it mean if we really had difficulties with China? Volkswagen, without their sales in China, they sell more cars in China than all the other cars they produce, and so on and so forth. There are so many examples. Talk about cell phones and all the other things. So of course we know we need also this relationship, but the question is, will we do it to their the way they ask for it, or can we find common rules in cooperating with China? So whenever now we talk about Russia, and that was also my experience from the last days, it took like 15-20 minutes and we talked about China, because, and here's really my last sentence, because this is the new fight between democracy and authoritarian regimes. And it started with a hot war, and nobody knows how it will go on. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brandstätter, for this fascinating talk, which included so many interesting and at the same time very complex topics and issues. I'm sure that we will have a lot of questions and contributions to the discussion. Please. And Ray will kindly inform us about what's going on in the chat and whether there are questions from the chat. I would like to ask the first question, if I may, and it is a very simple one. Or perhaps it's also a very, very complex one. The book is called Last Wake-Up Call for Europe. What, in your opinion, was the first wake-up call?
What was the first in Europe?
Yeah, what was the first wake-up call for Europe?
That's a good question. I think 2008 was important. You know, why? Because it's funny. When I was here in Berkeley in 2000, it was sure that we get the euro. When I talk to my American colleagues, they say, "Look at the euro dollar." They say, "No, it's not the euro dollar. It's the euro." Why do you know? Why don't we have the dollar together? Why do you need and so on? And I was living in Germany for a long time, and as I said, I had a lot of discussions with Mr. Kohl. And the fascinating thing about him, and that has something to do with history. Why did Kohl and Mitterrand, the socialist Mitterrand and the conservative Kohl, why did they get along? Because they were more or less of the same age. Mitterrand was part of the resistance. Helmut Kohl was too young for the war. He was born in 1930, so he was 15 years old when the war was over. But his brother was killed in the war, and they were meeting over the graves of their dead. You know, so they knew. And Mitterrand, in his last speech, which he had in the European Parliament in 1995, it was really funny because first of all he said, "Le nationalisme, c'est la guerre." So where is nationalism, there will be war. And then he said, you know, when you look at the French history, I realized that France had wars with all European countries, all of them, except for one. It's Denmark. And I don't even know why. You know, right, there was a reaction because it's funny. Why Denmark? The Austrians were fighting with Denmark once, 1860 something, whatever. So we had war all the time. So this generation, they knew what we had to do. And then we had the euro, and the euro was quite successful. And then there was this crisis, which I think started in the United States, is it true? With all these toxic papers and so on. And of course, the European banks were involved. And then there was the big question if we can keep the euro. And Mrs. Merkel then said, if the euro fails, Europe fails. It was a very clear sentence. And I think this was already a strong wake-up call because what did it tell us? It told us that we have to coordinate our financial systems much better, that we have to have that the finance ministers of the national states have to have more responsibility also for the European budget. And then came 2015, and then came COVID. And 2015 was the second one. And in 2015, we did not manage it. In 2015, there was a huge discussion in Europe if there could be a possibility to bring the refugees more or less according to people living in the national countries to those countries. And Austria and other countries said, no way, we will not do that. COVID was different. COVID also started with very nationalistic remarks. There was a meeting in January of 2020 in Brussels with the health ministers, and the Commission said we should do something together. And the health minister said, no, this is national law. You have nothing to do with that. But later on, they organized it better and better. And at the end was this resilience fund, 750 billion, always have to think milliarden billion, 750 billion euro to bring to all the European countries. And it's common money, you know, because normally there are these national budgets. But for the first time, we have a real European budget. So we had these three wake-up calls, and the two of them, I think we reacted right. And now it's the fourth, and I hope it's not the last one.
So I would like to invite the audience. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. It's really stimulating. And you mentioned before you actually got into the talk itself, this issue of Austrian neutrality.
Yeah.
Well, what happened? So that my question to you is just that. I mean, how do you relate to this debate now going on whether Austria should abandon its neutrality that started with the Staatsvertrag and all the rest of it? Are you in favor of shifting this or sticking with the old order?
Thank you very much. I really like this question because it tells me, and you're not the first one here in the States. And I feel, as an Austrian, I feel honored that you know about this, you know, because you're a small country, you know, neutrality, so that already is really great. For me, it's not so difficult to explain. The law for neutrality, which is part of the Austrian Constitution of 26th of October 55, which is our national holiday. In school, we learned, at school, we didn't learn that it was a day of neutrality. In school, we learned that the last soldier has left Austria this day, which was very good because it's a picture, you know, to say we are neutral is not a picture, but the last soldier, you see someone with a backpack leaving Austria, that's a beautiful picture. That's what we learned in school. But that's why we have this national holiday, 26th of October. And it's only 2 sentences. The first is we are not allowed to take part in a defense community or military community. And the second, no foreign soldiers on our soil. And it also say that it's according to Switzerland, and that means that we have to defend ourselves. It's not we are neutral and we don't care. We have to defend with our own army. So this is 1955. When we joined European Community and later the Lisbon Treaty and other treaties, we changed the constitution, and now it's written in the constitution, Article 23J, that the common defense policy of Europe is also part of Austria. And now, of course, you could say, does the one fit the other? And as they yell, it still does, because we say that we take part in defense. It's not a common army. It's not someone going on our soil. There's common defense. So we talk to each other, we help each other, and so on and so forth. But of course, it's a change in neutrality already. And now is the next step. What could be the next step? And so I say, let's think about what gives us security. Neutrality gave us a certain security during the Cold War, because it was also the story which we learned at school. They are meeting in Vienna, you know, Khrushchev and Kennedy came to Vienna. So they need a place to meet. Where do they meet right now? They meet in Turkey. Is Turkey neutral? No, Turkey is NATO. So the story that doesn't fit so well anymore. And the second thing is, of course, we built up our army. We did not spend as much as the Swiss, we spent more or less only half of it. And we know, and I know that from also personal talk to Helmut Kohl, in 1987, there was a maneuver, a NATO maneuver in Germany. And German and French troops were having, you know, was the kind of what they thought. The Russians would come through the Danube, the Valley of Danube, with their tanks. And if they had done that, the German, the NATO troops also would have gone into Austria. So they would not have accepted Austrian neutrality. So I asked Mr. Kohl, how can you do a maneuver with the idea that you go into a neutral country? And he, you know, he was tall like me, but had another BMI and a few more kilos. And he was very like this. And he said, you know who's defending you? You think your Bundesheer is defending you? You have no idea. We defend you. NATO defends your liberty and your freedom. Mm-hmm. And of course I said, no, it's not true. It's our Bundesheer. But I knew it was right and it was background, so I could not report about it, but very interesting. And Hugo Portisch, which I meant, also a famous journalist, he gave me an interview once where he said he was on both sides. He talked to the Americans, he talked to the Soviets. And of course, both sides said, if the one attack, we go into Austria. No doubt about that. And that's my point now. My point is security. What does give us security now? Is it our neutrality? No. Is it our Bundesheer alone? No, but it can be part of security. We have to have an army. So my answer is a common army. And we can build up this common army together with the Europeans. And here I come back to the question, why don't you join NATO? Because I don't know, it's your choice to vote for President Trump in 2 years or in 6 years for President whatever, or in 10 years. What will she or he say then? We don't need any, I don't need the Europeans. So we have to prepare ourselves. So that's why I say we need this common European army. Let's not discuss so much about neutrality, because neutrality actually is part of our identity. You can imagine a huge country, you know, an empire like Austria, which was diminished. And in 1918, people said, we don't even survive. After 45, it was a real success story. And part of the success story is that we found our identity. And part of the identity is neutrality. So if you do a referendum now, you will have 90% in favor of neutrality, because people, not because they think it gives us security, because they think it's part of, you know, of our identity. But if you say there is security problems, and we have other problems with terrorism, I always say Putin is a terrorist. He did terrorist attacks, not only in Chechnya, also in Moscow. So we need the cooperation, of course, of the services, and we need the cooperation of the European armies. And then, if that works out in 10, 20 years, let's talk about neutrality. At the moment, it doesn't really make sense, but it does make sense to say what gives us security, and it's not our army alone. And you have to be so honest as politicians to say that.
Let's perhaps take the next question from the chat.
Yes, so I will actually combine two questions because they have a very similar topic to what you just spoke on. The first from one of our audience members is your view of need for military buildup of EU defenses held by most leaders now, and how do you think it will proceed? And then sort of similar, but also sort of expanding sort of what we think of in terms of national security. Another audience member asks, a critical focus point in the current security concerns is about energy supply. In regards to future political developments, both within Austria and the EU, do you see countries favoring a greater focus on energy security within their borders?
Yes, I try to combine it because it has something to do with each other. And we know from speeches of Putin, and we know from speeches from his advisors, that it was their plan to make us dependent on Russian oil and gas. And we are dependent, that's a matter of fact. And there was a plan to do that. And in Austria, it was even that bad that they changed the management of OMV, which is the Austrian mineral company, in order to install a person who was a very good friend of Gerhard Schröder. And we know Schröder is Putin's agent in Germany. So this was it's very simple, yeah. And this was a plan to make us dependent, because Putin knows that I talked about the gross national product. He doesn't have the great products. They are really good in aerospace. They're still there's a very good cooperation with European Space Agency and the Russians, and they're good mathematicians. But there's no they don't keep up with modern economy. So, but what they have is, of course, those natural resources. So this was the plan. So we have to get independent, and that brings me back to the point. When we talked in Europe about we should buy more liquid gas from America, it was people coming immediately. The Americans, they just want to sell us their gas. That's why they are against Nord Stream 2. This tube coming from Russia, and that showed me very well that the relationship doesn't work so much, because we don't believe when the Americans say something, the Europeans don't even believe it. But when Putin says, you get our gas and it's all secure, then we believe it. So something changed, which is really dangerous. Really, we have to think about it. And talking about military, I think there is the Americans. They spend like 780 billion on defense every year. Chinese 270, and Russians less. Europeans are about 270 altogether. But what is the background? The background is that we all have different systems. There's one Italian general that he said in an interview a few days ago, if we change 200 different systems which we have in our armies to 30, we could save about a third of our expenses. So we could have, for the same money, much better military, or we could spend less if we organized it commonly, which is going to be difficult, to give. But something, the Germans gave up the German mark. And this was holy. Deutsche Mark was holy because in German history, inflation was the most terrible thing. Many people still remember. So to give up the German mark was a huge step. It needed a strong politician to explain it to people. And now we have to explain to people why we only have security if we do it together. And of course, I trust a Slovak or a German or a Lithuanian officer if he organizes something. We have to think about it. What can we do and what can others do? We don't have to do all the same, and then we cooperate. It's going to be difficult, I know, but we have to start now.
Thanks. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for your thoughts and decades of experience close to political decision and lawmaking. I want to come back to your portray of the world in two parts. Also authoritarian Russia, China, democratic, the West. But what about the authoritarian tendencies, governments that we have in Europe, in the European Union?
Oh, yes.
Including maybe France soon, if Le Pen wins the election, authoritarian,
Yeah.
right wing.
Yeah.
And what about the tendencies in the United States?
Yeah.
Don't we see the whole world moving towards authoritarianism?
Could you please briefly repeat for those in there?
Yes, I'm sorry. No, the question is, of course, we have the democratic and authoritarian systems, but we have strong tendencies in democracies towards authoritarian politicians and authoritarian systems. And that was the question. And my first answer is, that's why I'm in politics. Because also Austria was on this way. I always said, we are on the way to Hungary. And I want to stop the train before Hegyes Shalom and before Győr, these already Hungarian cities. Because, when I'm out of Austria, I don't want to talk very much about Austrian politics, but it's already history, so we can talk about it. This Chancellor Kurz had no strong convictions. I don't think that he wanted to be an authoritarian leader, but he wanted to be an authoritarian leader, but he didn't know why. Orban knows why. Orban is really dangerous because he says, whereas in Hungarian, I also have the right, have certain rights, which is very dangerous. And when you go to Hungary, they talk about Trianon, which is the peace treaty of 1920. And of course, we know that Hungary was much a bigger country, and certain areas where Hungarians were living were then part of Ukraine, part of Slovakia, part of in the south. Yeah, right. So, which is right, but it's history. But he still talks about it. Kurz was different. He wanted to build, and that's what they wrote in their WhatsApp. It all came out because of a cell phone with all those codes from their WhatsApps. It's you are part of the family. It's not you're part of the party, which is normal. You're part of the family, so we do something for you. It's also part of an authoritarian system, and which he did not accept. And I was made the chief of a newspaper. He did not accept free journalism. He called me and said, "You should not write that." And I said, "Why shouldn't I write that? I think it's right." "No, but it's different." So then I had to talk, a conversation. I even wrote a book about it called Kurz and Kicker. And there, right, we were sitting down at the table, and he says, "You have to decide, you are my friend or my enemy. And if you're my enemy, you have to take the consequences." A 30-year-old foreign minister, and then he was already head of his party, tells it to a journalist, "You have to decide." And that was really interesting. And then something changed also in my newspaper.
It's Carl Schmitt.
This is Carl Schmitt. You're very good. This is Carl Schmitt. The state decides what is right for the people. And that, but if you ask Kurz, Carl Schmitt, he would say, "No, I don't know him." He's really badly educated. He had a lot of intelligent people around him, and he knows how to look into a camera and how to be nice and how to bow his head when there is some important people. But he's very badly educated. He wouldn't know who is Carl Schmitt. But coming back to that, so when I saw, and I thought it was dangerous, and then we had this Ibiza scandal and everything, where we saw that not only the right-wing Austrian party, which we were convinced they would do it, but also the conservatives were going towards Hungary. And I didn't ask for it, but they asked me, "Why don't they run for a parliament?" I said, "Okay, I think I have to do something, and I have to fight against these tendencies." And we have these tendencies, as you said, we have the elections in France. We'll see. We had the elections in Serbia, which is very dangerous, because in the Balkans it's very dangerous. And why do people vote for those leaders? Because everything is going so complex and so complicated. And the genius of Kurz was very simple answers. He had for every very difficult, the only difficult complexes, if it is interior politics or if it's foreign politics, it's always very complicated. But he always had a simple answer. And that convinces people. And the big question is, can we convince that authoritarian regimes, and you see it in Hungary, they always tend to be corrupt. Kurz was corrupt, as we know right now. He is not convicted anymore before trial, but the way he talked with his cronies on WhatsApp, this was already corruption, because here, you're my friend, you get this, and I hate him, so we don't give him what he wants. This is already corruption. I don't say that he personally took money, but I really say he did everything to divide, and this is the important point, to divide, and here are my friends, here are my enemies. And as long as you're strong enough to divide your people at 51 to 49, you can govern this way. And then when you make laws like Orban, you have 50% of the votes and you get 2/3 of the mandates in parliament, then it's even easier. But this is the most dangerous thing, and that we have to explain. That when a politician starts, they are good, they are my friends, and they are bad. Kurz said all the foreigners they are dangerous, But he knew he would get the majority in Austria. If he says Syrians and Afghan people are dangerous, he would get the majority of the people, and then this way he won the elections. You're right. It's very dangerous, but probably now this is also an outcome of this war that we can explain how authoritarian leaders end. They end as warmongers. They end corrupt. That for sure. And whatever they do it to the disadvantage of their people. That's what Timothy Snyder writes in his book. That this is this policy of endlessness. I don't know how he says again. As when you as a political leader, when you can't solve the problems of your country, you always have to have enemies where we have to fight this and we have that and this idea and that idea, so you can solve your normal social policy problems or whatever you have in the country. And this is the dangerous point.
I learned that there are more questions on the chat.
Yes, we do have a couple. They are on slightly different topics, but I guess one that piggybacks very nicely on this point of the rise of the far right within Europe. I'm wondering, what is sort of the role of Brexit within this? Is Brexit
The role
of Brexit within this sort of
Brexit,
narrative that you're painting about sort of this wake-up call for Europe? Was Brexit in itself a wake-up call, and how does it fit into this larger narrative?
Yes, Brexit was a wake-up call, and I want that's the one point. It's a very diverse continent. I'm convinced of this European identity, but it's very diverse, and probably Europe made a mistake not to accept certain things which the British wanted to do different. Probably this was one point. But on the other hand, it was Prime Minister Cameron who saw the pressure of his Conservative Party. And he thought, okay, what the hell, let's do this referendum. Then I finally did, this problem is over because I have the majority, and everybody said he would get a majority. And then we talk about the other things. And that was wrong. And then, of course, it was influenced by Russian money. We know it in the meantime. Did I mention already the book, Putin's People? This is an incredible book, Putin's People by Pelton. 2 years ago, she wrote a book from Putin from the 1990 to now, how he changed Russia with the mafia, with the KGB, and also influencing right-wing parties in Europe, influencing the elections here, as we know, and influencing also Brexit. And there is one person, which I don't remember the name, which was quite obvious. He was financing a lot of Brexit, and there must have been Russian money going into it. Destabilize Europe has been for a very long time the aim of Putin, and Brexit was destabilizing Europe, of course. Let's see what happens within the next years. We know that young people in Britain didn't want to leave the European Union. We know the people in the cities didn't want to leave the European Union. And probably in a few years, there will be a discussion why they shouldn't come back, because they will see, the British Empire is over. They tried a certain, and he had good contact with Trump, I know that. But I think there are now discussions between the British and the European Commission, how they could better trade deals. So at the end, probably they will end as a soft member of the European Union.
So big thanks to our speaker. Unfortunately, we have to
Okay, thank you very much.
This event today.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much for an excellent presentation and also
Thank you.
for the great
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
and the questions. So thank you so
Thank you.
much. And also big thanks to the audience, to all who joined us today via Zoom, via live stream, or here in the room. And I hope that we will be welcoming you again to one or the other event.
Like
For
to do that, yeah.
example,
I would like to do that.
and also welcome the audience to other events, for example, to a conference which will take place on 20th of April on far-right politics in Austria, Europe, and the United States, which will be which is organized by the Institute for European Studies, co-sponsored by a couple of UC Berkeley departments, also by the Political Science Department of the University of Vienna, and in cooperation with Hotstiver Foundation and the Marshall Plan.